My name is Laura and I live in London.
Bonjour, moi c'est Anita et j'habite à Genève en Suisse. We are LGG Sisters,
helping you to treasure the Bible as more precious than gold.
And the joy of our hearts.
This exact video is also available in French on our French playlist. And if you'd like to download the Genesis study from Love God Greatly, go to the website and you can download it there for free.
How do we live and how do we affect our planet? The documentary from David Attenborough, we see how human beings have spoiled our planet. God is not really mentioned. However, today we will see with Laura, who is going to help us see what the Bible says about our perfect planet and how to respond to the mess that we human beings have done.
So I really wanted to talk about this topic of creation because I think it's so relevant nowadays, especially with this documentary with David Attenborough, being environmentally friendly and that kind of stuff. And Genesis 1 is really like a window into the character of God and what God is like. So let's open our Bibles, if you've got them there, to Genesis chapter 1. It's often the hardest page to find. In the beginning, God. And I find that really striking because it doesn't say in the beginning there was nothing, or in the beginning the universe was empty, thing like that. It says in the beginning God. And that's what I really want us to think about today, is God and who he is and what he's like. We see that through creation, the very first things ever that God does. So the first thing in the whole Bible we see about God is that he creates. He's making and giving and loving to give just because that's who God is. You think about it, this God who is Father, Son, Spirit has been existing in this triune loving relationship for all of eternity, is now overflowing in this generous creativity that we see in creation, Genesis 1. It is beautiful and good. Just have a look in verse 3. God makes light and he declares that good. And verse 10, he reports that the earth and the sea, although they're empty, they are good. Verse 12, all the plants and the vegetation are good. And you get the picture, but the author is really reminding us that God's creation is good. And he says this 7 times, including when God looks at everything and he describes it as very good. And we also see this beauty and goodness in creation in just the structure of how everything's created. Day 1 is the evening and the morning. Day 2 is empty waters and land. Day 3 is green plants and vegetation just colouring the earth. But then the last 3 days, we see the earth starting to come alive. It's really filled, I think, in days 4, 5 and 6. So the sky is filled with the sun, moon and stars. The land is filled with animals and the waters are filled with fish. How good is God to prepare an ordered and ready-made earth for its inhabitants? God didn't have to create, and he certainly didn't have to make anything beautiful, but he chose to make it beautiful because that's just the kind of God he is, a good and generous God. I'm sure Adam and Eve were grateful that God made a ready-made world for them, and they didn't have to navigate a fruitless land with no other life forms. And he brings in humanity at the end, not as sort of an afterthought, but actually as the climax to all that he's made so far. Look at verse 26, how it changes all the way through. He's been repeating, and God said, and God said. Verse 26, then God said, and it's like comes the best bit. Something different to anything that God has yet made. Something uniquely beautiful, uniquely different. God creates humanity that bears his own likeness. As if a perfect, beautiful earth doesn't point enough to God's generosity and goodness, he tops it all by making mini reflections of himself with dignity, responsibility, honor, creativity, and the capacity to lovingly relate to each other and ultimately to enjoy relationship with himself. Now, God didn't have to create, And he certainly didn't have to share it with anyone, but he chose to, just because of the kind of God he is, a good and generous God. I'm sure you're looking at the world around you and you're thinking, what is she talking about? The world is not perfect or good or orderly. And you'd be right, because despite God's goodness and generosity, humanity does something terrible in chapter 2. Adam and Eve reject this generous creator God and choose instead to worship his creation. They completely disregard God's perfect order by loving the fruit more than the one who made the fruit. They exchange the Trinitarian generous God and his overflowing love and relationship in order to serve themselves and to worship something incredibly inferior. How terrible, but also how foolish is that? They love the art rather than the artist. And it's like they're praising the music more than the composer. And so Adam and Eve wickedly pollute God's perfect world. Doesn't Genesis 1 just help us to hate sin so much more? When we see how good and generous and kind God is, and how this God is kicked to the side, aren't we convicted of how awful sin really is? And doesn't Genesis 1 help us to love the gospel so much more? It is this very goodness and generosity of God that overflows in the rescue that we see in the gospel, the rescue for our sin that spoiled this perfect world. God doesn't have to rescue us, especially since we willingly chose to reject him, but he chooses to rescue us just because that's the kind of God he is. Such a good and generous God.
Thank you, Laura, so much for this. So I'm going to be looking at application. And like Laura mentioned in Genesis 3, since the fall, we human beings have a tendency to look to the gifts, to the material things, to the earthly things, to the creation. And sometimes we forget about the creator and the giver of all those good things. For example, in this pandemic, it could be good health, or it could be career advancement, success in it, degrees, it could be money, it could be, this is a ring, could be relationships. I found myself often looking to do things and be like, just so focused on them that I tend to forget about who gave them to me. We would like to encourage you to remember that all those things come from the Creator and He wants to have a relationship with us. So let's remind ourselves that the most important thing that we have here on earth is what is going to have eternal value, and that is a relationship with God, and to invest in that, and to remember that those good things are great, but only if we remember that they come from God and that we worship Him instead of worshiping those things. It's a bit like somebody cooking a meal for you, and then you're worshiping the meal and you forget about the person who gave them to you. So yeah, I would really encourage you and remind myself as well to look to who gave them to me.
If you'd like to join the Love God Greatly community of women learning and studying the Bible, check the info in the description box below this video.
And look out for more videos on loving the Bible with the LGG Sisters.